Welcome back, Custom Grains fans. On this week's episode, I'm going to show you how to create this stunning epoxy charcuterie shell casing along with a set of 4 coasters. First step, you're going to want to use MG Chemicals 8329 or another silicone brand mold release spray and just spray it on like your normal cooktop pan. Now you can design your mold however you want. I personally just like to put a piece of black walnut in there to simulate gunpowder in the casing. The next step is to mix your epoxy. I'm a huge fan of Total Boat, so right now you'll see me use the tabletop epoxy, and later in the video you'll also see me use the deep pour epoxy. The Total Boat tabletop epoxy is a mixture of 1-to-1 ratio. Next step is to use some sort of epoxy pigment. Right here I'm using the brand called Mayspring. The wine red, Pacific blue, and then the pearl white are the 3 colors I chose for this. An important key of epoxy, you always want to mix it very well. 3 to 5 minutes is what Total Boat recommends. I lean towards the 4-minute mark, even in the 5-minute mark, just to make sure that the pigment is mixed thoroughly throughout the cup. Now, Total Boat recommends the tabletop epoxy to be no deeper than an 1/8 inch. Right now, I'm actually pushing it a little bit more of a 1/4 inch. I personally have had no bad luck with pouring a little bit deeper than what Total Boat recommends. But just to be leery, tabletop epoxy is meant for tabletops. It is not a deep pour, so you cannot pour it up to like 2 inches thick or 1 inch thick. So 1/4 inch is like risking the biscuit. You just saw me spray some more of that silicone mold release spray. It is much needed. It is the number 1 step that Craft Elements does recommend, is to use the mold release spray, because the epoxy does produce a ton of heat when it exothermic reacts, when it cures, and silicone does not like heat. It will destroy your mold, so make sure that you use the mold release spray. And then here are the 4 sets of coasters. So right now I'm just pouring it, making it look all pretty. I'll do the swirls about an hour and a half after I pour. That's when the Total Boat tabletop starts to thicken up. In your climate, the epoxy may cure faster than an hour and a half. Right here in Minnesota, I have my garage heated at 70 degrees and the humidity is 0 because it's wintertime. I'm a big fan of using the toothpick method just to make the swirls, just because it's a tight swirl pattern. And you're going to want to swirl it very slowly to make sure that you don't produce more air bubbles than necessary. So just nice, close, tight-knit swirl patterns. And then you'll want to run a torch or a heat gun over it. I personally like to use the torch method because with a heat gun, there's a cord. My luck, the cord drags on the sawdust right here on the floor, and then the cord's all sawdusty, and then sawdust gets in your project. So use a torch, in my opinion. So here's the next day. After the tabletop epoxy is cured, I like to use 220 grit sandpaper to sand the epoxy. Make it nice and rough, so then your next pour of epoxy has a good contact point to adhere to. If you don't do this step, what could potentially happen is that your next pour of epoxy will not adhere properly and it'll just crack right off. And then I like to shop vac off the remaining amount of dust. Here I'm just placing the shell casings on how I like. It really doesn't matter how you do it. And then I'm also using CA glue and activator to make the shell casings permanently stay to the epoxy, just so when I pour the epoxy, shell casings don't move, and it makes my life a lot simpler when I try to pop the air bubbles. When you're making these products for a consumer, and if you have it on your website, I personally always recommend use the same number of shells that your product listing shows. You definitely don't want to have your website show 6 casings and you only do 3 casings in the coasters, if that makes any sense. So once all the shell casings are tacked down with the CA glue, this is where you're going to want to use the Thickset Fathom by Total Boat. It is a 2-to-1 mixture ratio, and it is meant for deeper pours. The cure time for the deep pour epoxy is right around 4 days. I have reached up to 5 days here in Minnesota. So just let you know, it is a slower curing process because it doesn't produce as much exothermic heat to cure as fast. And then when you sand the coasters and the mold or any epoxy, Your next layer of epoxy is actually going to make the bottom layer clear, so you'll never see the scratches, which still amazes me to this day. And here comes a satisfying overview shot. Now there's a couple different ways that you could make sure that there's no air bubbles in your shell casings. You could use hot glue and like cap off the shell casing. You could fill the shell casing with epoxy before you pour it, and then that way it'd be filled. Or what I just recently saw, and I really wish I could find the creator, is use like a paper clip and force epoxy into the shell casing, so that way that there is no air in the shell casing or an air bubble that would pop up during the curing process. Now, like I mentioned, 5 days for the curing for this one, and ironically, there is the same amount of sawdust on the floor. But the pro about using the silicone mold release spray is how easy it is to demold it, and boom, you have another mold and start pouring again for another project. Now, here comes the spoiling part. I have a dual drum sander, and then this is where I sand off the top. You could use a router sled to make the wood even with the epoxy, or you could just pour the epoxy right with level with the wood. You could use your planer. The risk about a planer is that with this tip on the bullet itself, it could chip up. But that's why I just use the dual drum. Now, the dual drum sander doesn't get everything all perfectly, so then I hand sand. I know. I even have to hand sand. Now here is me just using a 1/4 inch roundover bit and rounding off the coasters, making them all nice and pretty. And then the next step here is I'm going to be sanding the coasters. And right now I'm just using 180 grit sandpaper, and I'm just scuffing it up, making sure everything looks all pretty, and not really pretty because you're sanding the epoxy. And then what I like to do is I spray water on it to get rid of the epoxy dust. And then I actually begin my third stage of epoxy pouring is going to be the tabletop epoxy. With working with epoxy, it's all about prep work, sanding, making sure all the imperfections come out perfect. That's my number one recommendation or advice working with epoxy is you're going to screw it up, make those mistakes early on, learn from those mistakes, and then sanding. Like, everything is sanding, and us woodworkers, yes, I know we hate sanding, but sanding is key when you're working with epoxy. Now here is the third pour of epoxy. I'm just using Total Boat tabletop epoxy again. Reminder, it is 1-to-1 ratio. And I'm just flood coating everything. So people question why I charge the prices that I charge. Well, first of all, epoxy is not cheap. Second of all, it's a lot of work with these projects. That's why I charge $100 for the 4-pack of coasters and $125 for the bullet casing. They come out perfect, but it's a lot of work. These aren't batch produced or manufacturer produced. It's all handmade and homemade here in my garage. So when you do a flood coat, you're going to get drops or driplets on the bottom of your workpieces. That is normal. After the flood coating does cure, you're going to go back to your sanding station and sand. That is just the beautiful nature of epoxy. And like I said earlier, I just prefer using fire over like a heat gun, just because with a heat gun, I always get sawdust on my projects from the cord. So quick run it over with the torch, pop all those tiny little air bubbles, and then stare at perfection here. And just look how satisfying the driplets are. 3, 2, 1. And like I stated earlier, after the flood coat does cure, see these little droplets? Unfortunately, you're going to have to hand sand it off. So right now I'm just using my Festool Rotex 125, and I do have it on the Rotex mode, so it's super aggressive. And then make sure that you hook it up to your shop vac, because you definitely do not want to be breathing this in. And you can't see it, but I actually do have my respirator on. I've been trying to be more PPE friendly in the workshop. And I actually get this question a ton. What do I use for my undercoat or my bottom coat? I'm actually using walrus oil furniture butter. Just use a very little bit, wipe it in, and then let it cure or quote unquote soak into the epoxy for a couple hours and then just buff off the excess. And on the bottom of the side, after I buffed it all off, actually I didn't buff it as good as I should looking at the video, but I did clear it off, before I shipped it out. Look how stunning this turned out. Thank you very much, Scott, for placing your order. Thank you for watching this video as well. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to like, subscribe, and follow. And then I also left all my links in the description below as well. Have a great night.